production. And that is, of course, our individual farms. We need to be able to track our own cost of production on our farms and not just assume it's an average across something. So I want to take a minute here to consider the impacts that our management has in considering hay on our farms. I love to always bring up Alan Williams' quote about how each decision we make on our farm has cascading and compounding effects. And those effects are never singular or linear in nature, but they're compounding in nature. And so that means that the way I decide to do things today on my farm matters. And I look across this picture of windrowed hay, and I think about a few different things. One, I'm thinking the fact that I'm harvesting a product and a lot of carbon from these acres, and I need to consider that carbon cycle when I'm looking at my operation. I'm also thinking of the fact that there's a lot of nutrients being transported in that process and how that's going to also impact my field as a whole and long term. So am I able to continue this haymaking process on this acreage and expect it to produce long term, or if that choice is going to have some effects that I'm going to have to consider moving forward. And so I look at things ecologically. We're offering a disturbance when we're cutting hay, raking hay, baling hay on acreage. And, is that a positive effect or is it not? And how do I compensate for that if it's a negative one? And we're going to talk a little bit about bale grazing later, which is a great way to answer that question.
Part of that ecological part, excuse me, Doug, part of that ecological disturbance also is just removing cover on that soil. And if you think about when we make hay, it's on warm, sunny days out there, and we've run digital reading thermometers out on hay ground during right after it was mown, and we can have soil temperatures upwards of 110, 115, 120 degrees out there on an 85, 90 degree day. And that has an influence on our evaporation rates of moisture in the soil. And as we remove moisture, and with those high temperatures, that's very stressful for the microbes in the soil. So you're right, it is part of it's a major disturbance factor. I don't know that we've totally, in the years thought about that, and what are ways we can mediate that or mitigate that to make sure that's a less of a disturbance versus a far more severe or even chronic disturbance.
Absolutely. And the temperature those microbes are looking for is the same temperatures that we find comfort in right now. They're looking for that, 68 to 72 degrees. And when we open up that canopy and we get that sun down there, we took away the shade. And so that's going to have that effect, of course. And then, so if we're having that kind of effect long term, again, are we going to expect the same production from those acres? Or is it going to reduce in time? I mean, look at, typical rotations on farms. Are we looking at sustaining a perennial system long-term? Or are we assuming that we have to work it up and reseed it over time because it's no longer productive? All things to consider as we go along. And those situations don't have to be the norm, by the way, on our farms. We can manage these perennial systems so that they actually increase in time and not decrease. Another thing is, I'll just point out, is the height in which these pictures are displaying the cutting height of forage, and it's pretty short. This is a picture of the way we sometimes did things in the past, and we don't necessarily do these same practices today. So I would encourage people, when they're looking at height of cut, when they're looking at their hay fields, to consider leaving more surface area for photosynthesis to take place. Will encourage faster recovery. So we're looking at the topic of carbon. Carbon is a topic in a lot, it's addressed a lot in the news these days for various reasons, environmentally, but, of course, we have our own impact and our own microenvironments on our farm. And so I want listeners today to think about each one of these bales as a unit of carbon as well, because whenever we're taking off carbon from these fields, that's going to disrupt the system, and the effect that has needs to be considered. So thinking about my farm, does my farm have a broken carbon cycle? Am I returning some of this carbon back to these areas that I'm taking it off of within the management of my farm? we're going to identify a few ways that we can reduce those nutrient losses and that broken carbon cycle on our farms. And this is my favorite. So think back a couple of slides and you saw those windrows. This is actually the same field looking from a different view. And this is how one of the ways in our farm that we are returning the nutrients and trying to close gaps in that broken carbon cycle that we have when we're exporting some of this hay off acres and not returning it back on. So we're actually bale grazing in the scenario. You can't see much hay because the cattle are covering most of it up. But by doing it on site, we do not have the losses associated with feeding in a feedlot and then transporting that litter back to the fields. There's tremendous losses associated with it. There's a number of studies out there. You can find a few online. And I think the big thing that caught my attention years ago when I first started learning about this practice was the fact that I can only get a portion of the manure, of the solids, but the urine is all lost. It's all volatilized off when we're looking at dry lot applications, feedlot situations. And so we can do a lot more of this that I once thought possible. And this is a great way to really look at soil health and how we can move things forward instead of having those broken cycles within our system. So the question before, that it posed was, should I be making hay myself? And, if we're a smaller scale operation, how much time do you really have, to dedicate to this? And is it going to be something where we're hoping that when we have time available with our schedule, that it's going to coincide with the time that we're going to need to make our hay? I kind of like this picture. It's a little bit blurry, but that kind of tells people that, sometimes there's a limited time. The rain cloud might be coming from the west, and in the situation with square bales here, we needed to get those all off and under cover before any rain came. So it is sensitive as far as when we're going to get this haymaking done in order to have good quality in the end.
When haymaking goes well, Doug, it is an enjoyable chore. It can often be an enjoyable chore. But when, like you said, those rain clouds are coming in, or when equipment breaks and you feel the pressure of time, it moves from enjoyable to torture pretty quick.
Absolutely. And on the next slide here, I'm showing has got, those headlights are already on. And yeah, it may have taken till this time of the day before we actually had dry hay ready to bale. And yeah, now it was go time. So
or got that flat tire fixed.
Yeah, that happens too. And you can see the equipment I'm displaying today is not new equipment. And so there's always a concern of making sure it's maintained properly so that we don't have that inopportune breakdown that's going to keep things from happening the way we want. So when we're looking at making hay or even buying hay, if we're looking at it, what's going to be the method? There's a variety of methods out there and in packages that we're working with. Is it going to be dry, for example? Because our approach is going to be quite a bit different than if we're looking at making wet hay or baleage or even haylage. Considerable differences if some of these things are new to you, or maybe you've always made dry hay, you're considering wet hay. There's of course learning curves to it all, and so we'll talk a little bit about that. The other thing is whatever method we choose, does it offer flexibility? So compared to the square bales that you saw before, which I said, that we wanted to get those in the shed before that rain cloud came up, in a round bale situation, some will consider it all right if we can get a rain or two on those, because they will shed more moisture. Some of the wet methods we can do hay in a day are, even offer other benefits as well. So in this case, we weren't required to bring the hay bales off the field right away because they were round in nature. And so there's a few things to look at in this one. We've got, of course, some dry hay on the truck. And we've also got a row of baleage in the back. That's what the row of the white is. And if you'll notice these hay bales, they look a little dark. And yes, they've been stored outside. And that was all right in our case in this one, but it may not fit your application. You may be buying hay. You're going to want maybe hay stored inside if you're buying, or you may think that, you're going to incur too much nutrient loss or loss in quality if you're storing outside. So some of the things that we're going to consider when we're looking at our different methods. And different options as far as transportation and storage. If you've got a lot of bales out in the field and you need to get them home in a certain period of time, what are you going to use to transport those, and where are you going to transport them? And again, what are acceptable losses to you, and are they really losses? So I put this slide up because I wanted to bring up a kind of an important to me topic when we're talking on different operations, and in a lot of cases, especially even dairy farms too, that we think we need to build things or we need to construct structures that we really feel we need. But the problem sometimes comes in is that what's it worth the day after I don't need it for what I thought I needed it for anymore? And in often cases, it's really worth nothing. Because something might be worth something to you and worth investing to you, but if it comes to a point in the future that you are going to look at selling that, it may not be worth the same. And so it's just a really important thing to consider when you're looking to make structural purchases along those lines. So here's one of our options. And Kent, why don't you join me in and talk about this picture a little bit, because you've got more history here, but we're talking about baleage. Kent, what do you think of when we're talking about baleage as far as the differences in our approach to management and even if it fits my operation?
Yeah, baleage, haylage, it's basically putting up wet hay at about 65% moisture and then ensiling it or wrapping it to cut off all oxygen exchange, to get it to go anaerobic, to get it to ferment in order to get it to preserve. The beauty of this is we can often do this in a single day. And if you're pressured for time, if you've got a lot of hay to make, you can get this up in rather short order. Where dry hay, it's going to have to lay out there for a few days. And the biggest disadvantage there is you're totally at the mercy of the weather, and that can be quite stressful. To lose an entire cutting of hay to a rain event can be devastating to an operation. And so a lot of outfits have moved to this. It requires some extra and some specialized equipment. You obviously need a baler that's can handle wet hay. Not all of them can. You need wrapping equipment. You need these are going to weigh a lot more, so you need bigger equipment to handle those. Baleage can be done in an inline wrap situation like we see here. We can also wrap individual bales. That does take more plastic, but for some people, that has advantages because those individually wrapped bales can be just left right out on the field where you want to feed them back out. If you want to do like Doug Sitter was talking about earlier, to get that carbon cycle, keep that carbon cycle from breaking. So now we can just move inline wrap bales like this to the side and wrap them in the same field to feed back out there. But it is another process that requires some machinery and some labor in order to do that. And then they have to be replaced out when you're done. So there's advantages and advantages to all of these. The other problem with baleage is the disposal of the plastic. Now, if you're in central and southern Minnesota, there are opportunities to recycle that. But if you're a small operator, they're not going to be interested. They like to see wrap from about 1,500 bales per farm per year in order to garner their attention for the recycler, because it's just economics of scale. That doesn't mean you can't partner with other farms to do that, but you do have to have a centralized spot to do it. And that requires some waste disposal to deal with. So, again, the advantage is you can get this up quickly. You can get it up in good shape. In general, baleage is often thought about as being better quality than dry hay. Not always, but just in general. And that's the baleage being a step down, if you will, from fresh on the stem. So, Doug, anything else you want to add to that?
A couple different things. And one is that the Kent had mentioned, hay in a day, I believe, and the fact that you can make it up in a day and it doesn't overnight and go through that cooling and warming process means that we can preserve more of the total dissolved solids or maintain a higher Brix level in our hay. Every time we overnight hay, it actually reduces the Brix level by 15 to 25% on average. So as far as quality, like you're talking about, it really does make a difference and something to consider going forward. The other thing is that a lot of farms still think they need a certain percentage of dry hay. There are farms out there that have gone to all baleage. In fact, we're feeding all baleage this year. And so that theory that I once kind of held too, now it's going to depend on your quality too. If you have all high rich, really high vegetative stuff, you might want to consider something that's going to have, adequate fiber or some bedding access for your cattle too. But we have gone from our own farm away from having to think that we had to have a certain percentage of dry hay along with baleage.
The other part about baleage or individually wrapped bales, whether tube line or whatever, it's in a weatherproof container. Now you can have problems with animals puncturing this, and you need to seal it back up. We've had crows peck through it. I know people that have had raccoons dig through the side of this stuff, deer break through the side of this. So it's something to watch. But when you do this, you don't need the investment, the capital investment in the building. This would be an annual expense for the plastic and disposal thereof. But you don't have a building that depreciates. So there's pluses and minuses there. And you have to weigh all these within, like we've been talking about here this morning, your context to your operation, and that includes your value system, it includes your location, it includes all of these things. If you're going to be making something like baleage, a distance from the field or the place where it's going to be fed from, it's expensive to haul water. And you don't want to be hauling around 65% moisture feed. You're not going to get as much on a trailer or on a truck to haul it back. So that gets to be expensive too. This needs to be something made close to where it's going to be utilized.
Absolutely.
Now, the other part of this is haylage. We're going to talk about that a little later, and that's putting up in another, the harvesting methods are the same. It's a different line of equipment, a little different method of storage and feeding. We'll talk about that here a little more in a couple slides.
So here we're going to talk a completely different scale altogether. And so if you're one that you have a smaller scale and you just need a little bit, you're even considering some of these options. So we're just going to throw this out there for those that it might apply to, and play a quick video here.
Yeah, this is illustrating two methods, one with a scythe by hand and the other with a BSC mower by hand. These are perfectly viable options for a small operation. The BSC mower, you may have other attachments you want to use on it. The scythe, there's obviously a skill set tied to that and a little bit of learning, but that's a learnable skill. We have some great resources even here in Minnesota for that. But this is just a side-by-side comparison just to illustrate that we may not need an internal combustion engine to do this. Now, this isn't going to work for 100 head of beef, stock cows. You're going to be pretty busy all summer, and you're only going to take down what you're going to get put up in very short order. We're going to show some storage methods for this in a little bit, but the point being here is, you need to scale your equipment to what makes sense for your operation, and there are different options. Let's jump to the next one, Doug.
Yeah, we're working on it here.
Okay.
There we go. So the next we'll just scale up a bit and just show that there are a variety of options and talk about just a few different options as far as cutting. This is low cost. This is, of course, older equipment again with a sickle, but in certain applications, it's very viable as well. We've got options such as sickle mowers, disc mowers, drum mowers, all which have their place, but in this case, cutting what appears to be cereal rye, the sickle mower is a very viable option.
Yeah, they each have their advantages and disadvantages. Sickle mowers, if you're fighting with rocks and pocket gopher mounds, they're pretty vulnerable to that. Disc mower has a little more durability. Drum mowers, certain types can have very few moving parts and very easy to repair. They also leave your hay in a windrow in a drum mower type setting, where a sickle mower and a disc mower are going to lay it more flat. So we need to match the tool to the job. If we're thinking about doing hay in a day, such as in a baleage or haylage situation, we want to lay it in what's called a wide swath, or about 85% of the cut width, 80 to 85% of the cut width, to allow it to dry out, to allow it to respirate. That's going to require possibly another pass by raking or merging. We're going to show a video of that here in a moment. But you got to match the tools and equipment to what you want to do. So doing something like this with old scale or old style equipment is, if you're handy with a wrench, and this may be the thing for you, but it doesn't take long for something like this to break down. And you're going to have to be prepared to do those repairs literally on the fly almost, in order to keep that operation going, because some years we just don't have a lot of good days for putting up dry hay. Oftentimes that's first crop, and we've had many years where even trying to get second and third crop up by making dry hay is a real challenge, to find that stretch of multiple days in a row in order to get it to dry, to not get rained on. Now, speaking of getting rained on, I just want to point out, in general, if you get less than a ½ inch of rain on, it's probably nothing to lose a lot of sleep over. But if we get a pounding 1.5 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch rain on hay that's laid down in a situation like this, it's probably going to become bedding material. So.
And thinking back to what you had said, Kent, about, being timely with some, repairs on the fly at times and that type of thing, Kent, do you enjoy pulling wrenches?
I do not.
Okay. So this is one of those questions.
I don't like it. So.
There you go. And so I think if we're looking at making our own hay, or what involvement we're going to have with our own haymaking, we have to consider that very aspect of things.
Yep.
If we enjoy that, we're going to do a good job of it more likely than if we hate the job, or just, it's not our favorite and we just don't put our heart into things, then we're not really setting ourselves up for the greatest success.
And especially if you're under pressure, to do this. And summer's always busy. And, we have a lot of people with small herds and flocks here. And a lot of those folks have other enterprises or off-farm employment that's keeping them busy. And so you have already, going into it, limited time to do this. So, really think that through. High blood pressure isn't any fun, and we don't need to burst a blood vessel over this stuff, but you do feel the pressure on some days with this stuff, with breakdowns, flat tires, it's not drying the way you need it to. You got growers market to go to tomorrow or whatever, and you just got to get this up. Do you have a personality that can handle that kind of pressure? So really think that through.
And do others want to be around you if you have that personality when things are challenging? Here's the next aspect of the haymaking. We're just talking about raking or merging. And, there's a number of different ways out there. Again, we're thinking a little bit smaller scale, something that, there's readily available used equipment out there to acquire, if that's what our goal is. And, with this, there's a lot of different methods in which rakes are made and how they transport product from one place to the next. I will say that the least material or least handling you have to do with your hay, the higher quality you can typically expect, because you're going to have leaf loss, you're going to have shatter, you're going to have field loss associated with that harvest method. And so, deciding what you consider acceptable margins in that is going to help determine what you feel you need for a tool for that job.
I think a lot of us would think about, buying and using used equipment just to help keep costs down. But if this is a new venture for you and you haven't been around that, realize that some of this equipment, it's getting very difficult, if not almost impossible, to get certain replacement parts for. And so, some of the stuff that's more common, it's not such a big deal. But I would also look around. Where's your nearest dealership? Where's the nearest places you're going to be able to get parts? Is it a 3-hour drive away, or is it a 15-minute drive away? Again, all that takes time. It adds up, and these breakdowns just seem to always happen at the most inopportune time.
Yeah, when you talk about getting parts for a lot of the machines, sometimes you can get the parts, but they're awful expensive, and sometimes you almost have to have some stuff machine made. Again, just looking at different scales of models, going back to some of the hand cutting, we actually can put up a fair amount of hay in this nature too, and some people are doing that very thing.
So this is Botan right here in Minnesota demonstrating this. He's a great resource. for those who might be of a scale where putting up hay by hand could be an option. So for people who are interested, we can get you more information on how to contact him later.
So this is often a go-to method of harvesting and storing hay. And again, we're going to come back to some of the same challenges we have with the age of equipment if we're looking at used equipment. And then the labor requirements that something like this takes is considerable too. We have to be considering the fact we need a couple different people for stacking, hay on a hay rack, the conditions in which we're asking people to perform with putting some of this material in a barn, for example. Kent, how many cool hay barns have you known stacking in your lifetime?
Only this time. I'm not stacking, only when I'm unloading this time of year.
Right.
Go to 150, Doug. 1 minute, 50 seconds.
There, thanks for a reminder. Get there.
Yeah, so for years, for many of us, this is what we grew up this is the haymaking that we recall from the past. This was common in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even into the 80s and 90s, and it's a great way to do it if you've got the equipment. We've got a train of equipment here that a person needs to maintain. If you want to get up a lot of this in a day, you're going to want multiple wagons, where once they're full, you just drop it, hook up another one, and keep going just for time efficiency. You're going to want to be able to tarp these or pull them under cover at night if you need to keep going and you're not going to be able to get them unloaded. I'm just going to jump in here with some tips if you're going to do small squares and you have to get it up and it's a little late and a little wet. Spreading it out, those bales out, not stacking them. We have to be concerned about internal combustion. Many a barn went up in flames by hay getting stuck in the mow that was too wet, and it was either loose hay or small square bales, like something like this. And so if it goes up a little wet and you've got the space, you're going to want to spread that out, cut side up, and you can tell when you look at the bale, and even salting it a little bit. But those are all things you want to plan for in advance as contingencies if you get in a jam with something like that. Yeah, this can be a great way to go for a small scale operation. Those small square bales are sure handy for, feeding that cow in the maternity pen or with a sick animal, or feeding young stock, or, use in a lambing jug or whatever. It's sure nice. It's sure nice to have. And a lot of livestock operators will do a percentage of this just because it's such a great tool. But you got to weigh that against the cost of owning a whole nother line of equipment. So we just want to present options, talk about the pros and cons, the advantages and disadvantages to help you make the best decision for your operation.
Kent, I'm glad you brought up the risk associated with damp or not fully cured hay. We had an experience years ago even where we made some hay in May and it started on fire the 3rd of July. And so, this was round bales, first crop that we put up. We were actually trying to double crop on that land that year. We took a crop of hay off and then we were looking to, do a cash crop that followed. But, it was just the right conditions one day that came across. And of course, this was festering for days and weeks before it got to that point. But it is a serious consideration. So it's something that we need to make sure that we do get a moisture tester and we have consistent hay across our field. And if we don't, we have.
You back, Doug?
I'm still here. Can you hear me?
There we go. Now we hear you.
Oh, great. Delay in the action. Kent, why don't you tell us about this picture with this gentleman with the stack?
Well, this is Gene Logsdon. Some of you have read, he's written a number of books. He's since passed, but this is a technique for doing hay by hand that I believe he developed. And again, depending on the size and scale of your operation, this may have some merit. He's got two just 16-foot cattle panels clipped together. There's a 7-foot steel T-post in the center of where they are. you build these stacks right out where you intend to feed them. And this is also the same field that they were cut in. And so when it's cut and it is cured, you just start piling the hay inside the a couple of, the ring here of these panels, and then just keep stacking it up, get it mounded over. And so it's going to look like a bunch of mushrooms out there. Some people will tarp these. But if you learn how to do a good job of stacking and mounding this, it can shed water quite well. So it's just another option. You can throw this loose hay on a rack. You can throw it in the back of a pickup. You can even have a old barn door you drag behind the tractor or the pickup or whatever to throw hay down and get it here. But we just want to show a variety of options for scale. And so that if you are a small scale and you just have a few animals around, some of this stuff may be more economically viable to you. And I like this technique because it allows us to return the carbon right back on site where it came from. So.
Kent, let's take a minute to talk about waste. What happens if I'm new to this and I'm used to feeding in a feedlot, and I think of looking at somebody feeding out in a pasture, the first thing I think of is waste. And why would I ever consider wasting that much product? What would your response be?
Well, if we're feeding the biology in the soil, we don't consider it waste. We consider it feeding our other group of livestock that we're managing out there, but we don't see unless we're carrying a microscope with us. And so it can be highly valuable. Oftentimes when we are doing bale grazing, some people are initially very concerned about the amount of quote unquote waste that's out there. But what are they leaving behind? Particularly in a dry hay situation, what they're leaving behind is the lignified stems. It's not really good hay. It's not really good livestock feed anyway. We get by a lot of this if we're using a mixer wagon because we chop and grind and mix and, turn it with everything else and then feed it out to entice them to eat it. But in a bale situation, that's much harder to do. Well, this lignified stuff becomes great food for the biology in the soil, particularly stimulating that fungal group of organisms, which is what most of our agricultural soil really needs. And so we can be strategic in where we feed to take advantage of that quote unquote waste and do a whole lot to improving overall health and productivity of that field.
Absolutely. I'll just echo that with waste is only a human concept. We don't find waste in nature. And so,
yes.
Like you talked about, those high lignin materials, that lower percentage of the plant, if you cut it off at ground level, that lower level is the high lignin, but that's the fungal food. And biologically, if you look at our most limiting factor in our cropping operations, it is that fungal to bacterial ratio. We want it to be 1-to-1. And if we're taking away all the food for that fungal community, then we're going to reduce our production over time. Another great option. Kent, let's talk about this one.
Yeah, self-feeding silage clamp. I did not have the best picture of this. This one happens to be from the UK. But the idea here is we make a silage pile not as high as this. The maximum height should be 4 feet, 3 feet would be better. And we allow the animals using a hot wire for them to self-feed on this pile and work their way into it. The silage does need to be, compressed. So you need to be able to drive and pack this down. The width of the pile, we should think about 8 inches of pile face. We're seeing the face here, the narrow side of the pile, not the long side of the pile or the slope side of the pile. Should be 8 inches for every animal that's going to be feeding off of this. That wire's at approximately 3 feet high for cattle. You're going to want to adjust this a little bit. I've done this. I know our Jared Lumen, our soil health lead, his dad's done this. There's a couple people that have done this in Minnesota. We do want these piles preferably with a windbreak to the north and or west. The face of this pile should be facing to the south. You may want to think about having 2 piles. If you cannot put this on a piece of concrete, and if you have a piece of concrete, that's great. It doesn't have to be, but the side the animals are on preferably would be a little just slightly downslope. and going slightly upslope here with a windbreak facing south. If you're in an area where you've got heavy soils, you may want a second clamp somewhere where they're not going to mud it up once spring thaw comes, but it can be somewhere else when the ground is frozen like it is now. And so this can be a great option. We can walk through details with people who want to know more about this, but it could be a very, very cheap way to put up hay. Basically, you do it like hay in a day. You do a wide row swath, you cut it, and then you can use devices like what's called a buck rake. And these can be custom made, one for the 3-point hitch on the back of your tractor, one for the loader on the front. And so you can pick up a scoop, kind of like Bataan with the rake, pushing up a pile there. You just push it up with the buck rake, collect enough to fill the rake, take it over to the pile, dump it out, and set it up. So again, what's your context? How many animals are you feeding? What equipment do you have available? What's the layout of your farm? You can build multiple ones of these things and almost simulate like we do bale grazing. It's going to be more concentrated in one spot, but if you've got a sandy knob or whatever, and you can put up an artificial windbreak next to it, this can be a great tool for rebuilding soil fertility. I was just on the phone with a farm or on a webinar with a farm here last week, and they were talking about reclaiming an old gravel pit site. This could be a way, or if you're not bale grazing, to do some of that. Okay, so just another tool for the toolbox here. There's a few things you got to do to make this work really well for you. It is an option. It's a cheap option, a really cheap option to go. It takes some of the risk out of getting dry hay put up. Just something to think about.
It brings another interesting thought to mind, Kent, as far as, we're talking hay and we're talking the ability to put it up wet. Central Minnesota, especially here, there's a lot of history as far as haylage goes and chopping it. Just thinking about those different methods too, is that, the context, like I said, sometimes changes over time. And, just think of the paradox, I guess, when you're looking at the two options as far as baleage or chopped haylage, to think about how much energy we put into reducing that product down to a certain size. And then we transport that product by blowing air around through it and exposing all of that particle surface area to air. And then we spend the other rest of the time or energy trying to get the air out, whether that's by driving a tractor over a pile or blowing it into a tower silo for gravity to take hold. Some of these methods, I'm not going to say they shouldn't be used, but we just really have to look at overall efficiencies when we're considering these and what we're willing to expend, what equipment we have access to within our context and just long term with those things. So think about the labor requirements to do some of these things and having to have enough people to run loads back and forth to the blower. And again, some of these units, so there's not a lot of, people filling silos as much as there once was, and some of the availability of that equipment. But there are a number of different options, and we certainly want to consider everything. There's also
one. Go ahead.
There's also the option in baleage, whether we're going to have cutters in that baling system that we need to pre-cut our baleage, and I guess really consider your application in some of the situations that you're going to use that product, and if it's really necessary or not. It's almost like asking if we needed to, the cow, she chews her cud for a reason. And I would challenge a lot of people to consider the fact that they may not have to process some of their product as much as they think they have to, or, even if we're grinding hay, why are we having to grind this hay to mix it with things? If it's good, cattle should be able to, eat it the way it is in a lot of cases. Do we really need to put, again, steel between our feed and our cow, and what's it going to cost us, and why do we think we have to do it to begin with?
Yeah, so the original idea for this method of a self-feeding silage clamp came out of the British Isles in the late 1940s, and they were doing it with long stem hay. And so we can take some of those mechanical processes out. The movement has been towards chopping and blowing and packing and everything else, to try and get the most per acre out of that. But, if we now no longer look as waste, but as food for the soil, we can start rethinking these things, start seeing things differently, as you'll often hear people in the regenerative ag world talk about. When we start seeing things differently and how we use these things, it can open up a host of opportunities and maybe save us a whole lot of money in the process. So even, a lot of people will tell you now in these piles where you absolutely have to tarp them. And the old timers, when they didn't have plastic, the original method for this, they did not tarp it. They did not do anything with it. Other people have sown some of these piles with oats on top. So you actually had a living plant up there growing. So there's advantages and disadvantages to each, but just understand there's just a host of different ways to do this. And we haven't even talked about bagging yet. That's another way of handling chopped grass silage. That requires at least 100 horsepower tractor to run the bagger. You do burn up a lot of fuel. It can make great quality feed. You do need a firm pad to put it on so you don't have a mess. And with all of these different silage methodologies, you have to have enough animals to use enough of the front face of that silage in order to keep it fresh, to keep it from going bad before you feed it to those animals. So that's something else to think about.
Absolutely. And we can have a self-feeding situation with a silage bag as well. We've done that before with the head gate. And as far as the amount that we're going to consume, of course, we want to consider what time of year we're looking to feed that product to. So warmer weather, of course, we're going to have to consume more in that face than if it's colder in the wintertime. Well, and kind of with that, this is a snapshot of us. We're willing and happy to help anybody continue a conversation on this topic. If you have individual needs you'd like to discuss, please reach out to us. We'd be happy to talk to you about that. That's what we do. And I guess I'm not sure, Kent, are there some questions that may have come in? Or
we have some questions and comments we can go through. And just to let everybody know, we got about 8 or 9 minutes left here. We can go beyond the 12 o'clock time. So if you do have to leave, that's fine, but we're more than willing to stay on to answer questions and interject other people's comments, because in just an hour, we're not able to cover everything. We had to kind of hit the high points here. So we'll go through these and keep going. If you do have more questions, please type them into the chat. And we're just, Doug and I are willing to keep going here and hit as many of these as we can. So the first one here is from Evangelette, and it says, do you have any additional advice or references for cut height from your experience or other studies? I know that the type of forage has an impact and have read some of the UM studies and was surprised by the results and recommendations. I also realize, if I can get my cursor to work here, that the goals may be different for those studies compared to some of our operations. Doug, you want to start on that?
Absolutely. Cut height. So we got to think of a few different things with cut height. One, we want to think about the plant itself, and the more solar collectors we can leave, the faster it's going to be able to recover. And overall, we'll have more productivity. The other side of things is the lower you cut that, and depending on which cutting that is in the season, if it's the first cutting or if it's a later cutting in the season, again, that's the higher lignin content of the material. So we want to certainly think about the class of livestock. For example, if we've got a dry beef cow that's at earlier stage of gestation, her requirements are quite low, and we could probably afford to have a little more of that high lignin content in the first crop hay, for example, in that bale or in that system, if we want, just to keep enough bulk and keep her going. But if we wanted higher value feed, we want to certainly cut it higher too. I know some guys that have even put higher skids on their disc mowers, for example, to accomplish this. Sometimes there's enough flexibility and adjustments on units that you can do that without. But certainly you don't want to be down tight against the ground. The other thing to consider is, your method of harvesting too, as far as your rake. Sometimes you can get more ash in your bale, for example, if you're cutting lower to the ground and you have a wheel rake that's going to be dragging or not set properly. So it's not as sensitive. It's going to be raking a lot of dirt and material into your windrow. So a higher cut will help you do that as well, along with maybe a rolling basket hay side delivery rake like we had before. But typically, yes, I would say as a whole, farms most of the time cut lower than I would like to see, and we could also help shade that ground longer if we leave more stubble.
Absolutely, absolutely. I don't have much to add to that. So Carl has offered some haymaking videos here. https://kyleweber.name/ So if you want to check those out, I'm not familiar with those. Okay, from Chris, let's see. Can you outline how winter feeding or bale grazing specifically differs with baleage versus dry hay? Doug, I'll let you start on that one too.
You bet. So if we're talking baleage, first of all, we should talk a little bit if we're talking tube line bales or if we're talking individually wrapped bales, because one of the biggest advantages of bale grazing, if we're talking whole bales now, is the ability to pre-place those bales in the fall when the weather is nice and not have to start a diesel engine on a day like today. And or the other alternative is feed enough for a week at a time if you're doing whole bale grazing. If you want to distribute your impact, your animal impact and your litter over more acres, considering unrolling or distributing the bales to spread them out, and you can distribute your litter. I've done both on our farm here. And when it comes to distributing baleage, sometimes I can't always unroll in weather like this. So what I would do if I wanted to distribute a bale of baleage, I would simply set the bale down and spear one tine of my loader close to the surface edge on top of the bale and kind of break through that outer crust and lift the rest of the bale to kind of do like you're peeling a banana. And then I'll distribute baleage like that. So if you're going to do whole bales, you can really concentrate in an area of your pasture that you want to improve drastically, because you're going to leave more litter behind, more urine behind in those areas. So baleage is a great tool for bale grazing. They actually have less refuse than they would with dry hay as far as what they're going to leave behind. And so, like for example, right now we're feeding a week's worth at a time. We'll pre-place bales a week at a time out in an area that I want to address in our pasture with baleage, and just put them cylinder up. These are from a tube line. We actually cut the plastic off and leave them. We don't come back for another week until we're ready to feed again. So that's an excellent way to improve pastures. And also, I will add that compared to the effect that feeding daily has, if you're gonna go out and unroll daily, we have a different animal behavior that we impact. And so it's kind of like classical conditioning, the animals hear that tractor run, they're ready to eat. You are affecting animal behavior a bit compared to feeding more days at a time. And my example is, I actually just recently realized how significant the barometric pressure makes in animal behavior. The cattle will actually consume more calories when the barometric pressure starts to influence and indicate a change in weather to come. So they'll eat more calories to prepare themselves for lower temperatures like we're experiencing right now, where the animal may not have that ability if you're just feeding what you feel they need to for each day and expecting them to clean up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've fed a lot of baleage for years. You can see where you were last time, unless you get a really major snowstorm, which is very, very rare. So you can get pretty even distribution with baleage, even though you don't pre-place everything. But the beauty with dry hay is, and some of the best bale grazers I know in Minnesota, they don't even own a skid loader. They rent one for an afternoon, and they go out and place everything they need for a 50+ cow herd plus young stock for an entire winter in an afternoon with a skid steer loader. Now those bales are pre-placed out on that paddock, so during the summer, so they're on the edge and protected by a wire to keep the animals out of them. But it's just a matter of dropping the wire and then distributing them out where you want those. So that's kind of nice if you're limited on equipment. That's a great way to go. And like Doug said, you don't have to go out and fire it up on a day like this. But if you're feeding, once a week or twice a week, something like Baleage, you can kind of plan a little bit and watch the weather. It just gets to be a problem when we get a long stretch of cold like this. At some point in time, you got to go brave the elements and make it happen. So for your animals, so advantages to disadvantages to each, but yeah, they both can be done. Okay, next question. Where can I find more information on salting small bales? I can jump in on that one, Doug. Basically, the small squares, you bring them in, you spread them out under a roof with the cut ends up. You can look at the bale and see where the bulk of the cut ends are on which side of the bale. You tip that up, and then just a couple handfuls of plain livestock salt. Have those bags handy, on hand before. Hey, worst case scenarios, if you don't need it, you just, feed it to the livestock later. So kind of nice, but have that handy. I just go dump some salt in the pail and go along and just systematically work my way across the bales with a couple handfuls on the top. Let it sit for a few days, and it actually increases the palatability of that hay for the livestock, we often find. So it's an extra expense, it's an extra labor piece, but it really helps draw that moisture out and goes a long way to keeping a good quality hay and preventing spontaneous combustion. Anything you want to add to that, Doug?
No, I think that's pretty good. I guess I wouldn't plan on using that unless you had to. It's
Right.
kind of another step B. If you find some bales in a load that you went through a low spot in a field, for example, and you needed to address those. But I would caution against planning to use that as a preserving method.
Yeah. Yep. All right, let's see. Mike, this is from Mike. As a guy who puts up several thousand small square bales each year, I'll just reemphasize Doug and Kent's points about maintenance. I go through once a season and check all the major components of my haymaking equipment, bearings, belts, chains, gearboxes, knotters, U-joints, etc., and do preventative maintenance. The idea, if things are going well, is to only have downtime for normal wear parts like sickle teeth, rock guards, shear pins, etc., that are quick to change out and get going again. Absolutely, Mike. Couldn't agree with you more. And if those aren't things you're comfortable doing and used to doing and know how to do, Mike, when are you having a class? No, I'm kidding. So
thanks for the comment, Mike.
That's a good comment, Mike. Okay. From Chris, thoughts on the ideal carbon nutrient replacement for hay fields that are not able to be grazed. Non-chemical is possible. Also timing of those applications. Thanks. You want to start with that, Doug?
Absolutely. First of all, we sometimes think some of these areas aren't grazable. And I'll agree with you. Sometimes they're not, but I would encourage you to think outside the box or just explore all possibilities at any given time of how you might be able to incorporate feeding on that field, even if it's not in the winter. But if you do need to, think of carbon first. So I like to use livestock manures whenever possible if I'm trying to replace nutrients in the system like that. Timing of application, we're looking at fall. The contrast that against using synthetics, and this could be a day-long conversation in and of itself, but the comparison I like to use when we're looking at livestock manures, and there is a variety, and there's a lot of, there's a big difference between one to the next. We've got poultry litters, we've got, good and bad for those. We've got pen pack, we've got liquid slurry. We all have to address those individually upon what we're looking at doing and what we have available in our area. But again, we're always trying to compare against nature and model after nature when we're trying to manage these things. So livestock manures, first of all, I like ones that have higher carbon content in them, like poultry litter that has some wood chips in it, wood shavings. Livestock, as far as cattle manure that has a lot of bedding in it, is also good. Stable form. We're going to collect more nutrients from that and transport them if we have a high carbon content in our bedding. And then just the difference in the effect. So whenever we add synthetics to a system, what we're doing is we're promoting for lazy microbes. And those microbes are what we're otherwise asking to do the job of changing our geology into a plant available form for our plant growth. So even if, I'll just say that even if we see more volume out there, that doesn't necessarily equate to better. We can grow more volume and require our animals to consume more for the same nutrients that we would in other situations because of nutrient density. And so synthetics absolutely affect nutrient density in our applications. What else are you thinking on that one, Kent?
Yeah. Again, Doug, you brought this up, just creative ways to get animals to places oftentimes we don't think is possible. We've done entire, presentations on this stuff, but just a couple thoughts here real quick. Maybe you can't outwinter animals there for whatever reason, but can we graze that last crop of hay instead of taking it off mechanically? Can be a way to at least integrate livestock on that site. There's a host of creative ways to do watering systems out there, and so oftentimes that's stated as the limiting factor, but there's far more ways to get water to livestock, I think, than we often think about. Fencing, we've designed semi-permanent systems out there that are not crazy expensive, and these can be used other places. So that's a possibility, and we've done whole workshops on that and presentations on that. Loadout systems, the design built by, or the idea came from a gentleman called Bud Williams. He designed what's called the Bud Box. You can go on YouTube and watch some videos about this. This can all be made out of portable materials to help facilitate loading. So we've kind of answered the big questions there, loadout and transportation, fencing, water. It becomes much more doable as a way to do that. So I just want to add those as options. Another question here from Chris.
Kent, if I could make one more comment. The last one thing that came to mind while you were sharing was, considering leaving a crop of hay behind, a standing crop. Yeah. And, if you do that, you're leaving some of that carbon in the system, and that's a great environment to introduce some livestock manure if that's, an option for you.
Yep. Another question here from Chris. So to clarify on bale grazing, baleage equals more yardage cost, i.e. more time feeding through the winter as opposed to dry hay that is set out in the early winter and metered out with polywire. Doug, you want to start on that?
I feel it does, yes, in part. The only exception with that to be is if you did individually wrapped bales and you pre-placed those individually wrapped bales like you would dry hay bales. And that's a beautiful thing. I've often considered doing that on our own farm for that reason altogether. And then you simply unwrap them when you want the cattle to have access to those. The other thing I want to kind of throw out there is, we talked about using a hot wire to limit the number of bales that the cattle have access to. That can sometimes be tricky in the wintertime with snow being an insulator to a certain degree when you're using a hot wire. Sometimes you have to put up a ground wire as well, so a 2-wire system if your cattle are looking to challenge some of those scenarios, and just to provide that shock value, keep them out. Oftentimes too, I've talked with producers that have had individual paddocks that they'll put bales in, and then they'll just rotate them around to different paddocks. They may have a month's worth of feed in one paddock for the cattle to consume, and then they'll just move them from paddock to paddock.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Unfortunately, there's no one perfect system or one size fits all. Just evaluate the pros and cons of each of these. Do your research, think it through how it's going to fit in your context to find the one that's going to work best for you. All right, so Evangelette, any quick parting tips or sources for evaluating forage quality when purchasing? Doug, you want to start on that?
The first one I love to use is if I have access to the source of my feed, I'll love to go buy an individual bale and bring it home and feed it to my livestock. That I think is the best way to approach it. We can have the best numbers on a piece of paper, and the problem is nobody's taken the time or been successful at getting the cows to read. So they just don't know they're supposed to like that hay, right? So I like to sample. I like to have the cattle sample it. We've got so many different factors to consider. And then looking at, of course, the appropriate hay quality for whatever our livestock needs are at the time.
Yep, absolutely. We got to listen to the animals. What do they like? I have purchased hay myself. The numbers were outstanding on it, and that bale sat there all winter. They had no interest in it, and yet the quote science said that they should have just gobbled it right up. Other things to look for, you can use the numbers. Relative feed quality tends to be leans you a bit more towards the grass, forage with grasses in it, and relative feed value is more alfalfa based. Again, they're formulas based on some measurements to get you a number, some sort of metric out there. Reach inside a few bales, and if they're round bales or squares, pull some out, have a look at it. Does it have the grass legume percentages you want? What all is in there? Is there some diversity in the mix, or do you just want straight alfalfa or straight Timothy hay or whatever? Pull some out, have a look at it. What does the color look like? What does it smell like? What does it feel like? Is it dusty? Is it moldy? Is it black, or is it, a nice color? So all those things can be valuable, but like Doug said, the final test is, will the animals eat it and do well on it? So let's see, a couple thank yous there. And so I don't see any more comments in the chat or questions. We are after 12, a little bit after. So we'll just give a minute. If there's one last question or comment people want to type in, please do. If not, any parting thoughts or comments, Doug, here?
Oh, it's been a pleasure. I love talking hay. I love talking about perennial systems and what it does for the ecosystem if managed properly. It's a great way for us to use hay as a tool to improve our pastures, improve our hay ground, and it doesn't have to be a degrading system. And one last thing was I would always promote, diversity in our plant species when we're looking at feeding to livestock.
Very good. Yes. Thank you all for coming. If you do have more specific questions on some of the things we talked about today, this is going to be recorded if you want to go back and listen to it, or feel free to contact Doug or myself, and we'd be happy to discuss these things with you and direct you to more resources if necessary. So unless there's anything else, thank you so much. Stay warm. Have a great weekend. Enjoy the rest of the conference.